Now, to be specific, you cannot impeach a president on an unsourced allegation. But what Professor Dershowitz was saying, even if everything in there was true, it constitutionally doesn't rise to that level. But I want to be clear on this, because there's a lot of speculation out there. With regard to what John Bolton has said, which referenced a number of individuals, we'll start with the president. Here's what the president said in response to that New York Times piece. I never told John Bolton that the aid to Ukraine was tied to investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens. In fact, he never complained about this at the time of his very public termination. If John Bolton said this, it was only to sell a book. The Department of Justice. While the Department of Justice has not reviewed Mr. Bolton's manuscript, the New York Times account of his conversation grossly mischaracterizes what Attorney General Barr and Bolton discussed. There was no discussion of personal favors or undue influence on investigations, nor did the Attorney General state that the President's conversations with foreign leaders were improper. The Vice President's Chief of Staff issued a statement. In every conversation with the President and the Vice President, in preparation for our trip to Poland, remember that was the trip that was being planned for the meeting with President Zelensky, the President consistently expressed his frustration that the United States was bearing the lion's share of responsibility for aid to Ukraine and that European nations weren't doing their part. The President also expressed concerns about corruption in Ukraine, and at no time did I hear him tie Ukraine aid to investigations into the Biden family or Burisma.
At this point, who really needs a prosecution with a defense like this? This is one of Trump's impeachment lawyers, Jay Sekulow, saying with a straight face that you cannot impeach a president on an unsourced allegation. Yeah, if only there was a way to source it, like, oh, I don't know, a former national security advisor who has firsthand knowledge of the situation and has expressed interest in testifying and has made national headlines about his involvement. Seriously, for the Trump legal team to decry the fact that they don't have any first-hand sources, while the biggest point of contention is their unwillingness to call John Bolton to testify, is a bigger blow to their defense than anything the Democrats could have come up with. The reality is that the Trump administration short-sightedly predicated their defense on something so easily disprovable. By leaning into this idea that there was no conditionality, no quid pro quo from day one, by screaming it at reporters and tweeting it in all-caps tweets, and basically just stopping short of printing it on t-shirts, the White House rendered themselves vulnerable in the event that one, just one, administration official or first-hand source was to refute their claims. And so far, by the way, we have three. From Gordon Sondland.
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes.
To Mick Mulvaney.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
To John Bolton, not only did Trump set himself up for failure since the beginning, but even his legal team has continued to undermine this defense with their own bungled arguments during the trial. And of course, Sekulow goes on to make other tenuous arguments. He cites Alan Dershowitz, who himself unilaterally decided that abuse of power isn't an impeachable offense. Of course, there is zero basis for what he said. One of Nixon's articles of impeachment before he resigned was abuse of power. One of Clinton's articles of impeachment was abuse of power. There isn't a single constitutional scholar in America who's willing to come forward and say that abuse of power isn't impeachable. But because Dershowitz pulled it out of thin air and proclaimed that suddenly it's no longer impeachable, Republicans are treating it like it's gospel. But just a note, just because someone says something doesn't make it true. I can say that water isn't wet. I can even get a bunch of my friends to nod their heads. That doesn't will it into existence. Sekulow goes on, hilariously I think, to read a bunch of statements from administration officials denying Bolton's allegations, as if that should do the trick. He quotes the Department of Justice, which, to be clear, is overseen by Bill Barr, who is as shameless a mouthpiece for Trump as they come. Remember, this is the guy who refused to release the Mueller report until he could give his own summary of the report that fundamentally and grossly mischaracterized what the report actually said. But hey, I'm sure he's totally impartial now. Sekulow quotes Trump himself denying the allegations, and given the fact that Trump won't testify under oath and won't let anyone in his administration testify under oath, I'm just gonna let you put two and two together and make your own determination about his credibility here. And finally, Sekulow quotes Mike Pence's chief of staff saying things like, "At no time did I hear him tie the Ukraine aid to investigations into the Biden family," as if that absolves the guy. A note saying, "I didn't hear anything." Again, that he wouldn't even show up to say that himself, but rather passed it along in some arbitrary statement to be read by someone else, goes to show just how invested these administration officials are in their own defenses. Here's what it boils down to. Underneath all of the gaslighting by Trump's lawyers, all of the baseless legal arguments and clumsy justifications, the simple fact is that this is not a fair trial without witnesses. Blocking John Bolton and others who have relevant testimony is nothing more than a continuation of the obstruction of Congress that Trump is being impeached for in the first place. And most importantly, failing to convict Trump without hearing from witnesses first renders it completely illegitimate. And that's something that the vast majority of Americans can all agree on.